Many times people avoid reading or teaching the book of Revelations because they actually fear the end times. For me, the book of Numbers is way scarier than the book of Revelations, because in the book of Revelations, we, the church, we win. But it's the book of Numbers that causes some deep discomfort in my spirit. And why is that? Because for God to reveal to me the promises that He has for me, and like the children of Israel, it takes 40 years for me to receive them, that makes me uncomfortable. And it's not because God is not capable, okay? Because He proved to the children of Israel His capabilities, even when they were in Egypt. But it's because of their lack of faith when it was time for them to go through the wilderness, not realizing that the same God that helped them escape the Egyptians is the same God that will help them through the wilderness. What could have been a short journey from Sinai into Canaan became 40 years of them wandering in the wilderness because of Israel's lack of faith in God. Can you see now why Numbers causes some discomfort in my spirit? I would hate for it to take 40 years for me to receive the promises that God has given me, or God has promised me. Many of their children, their wives, even some of the men died in the wilderness. They never got a chance to see the promised land because they're complaining, they're moaning, they're groaning, their rebellion and their lack of faith delayed the promise. Now, this passage is coming from Numbers, the 14th chapter, the 1st through the 25th verse. Verses 1 through 4 shows the grumbling rebellion against God and His promise of the land, and how their rebellion reached a climax. Now, the Israelite congregation began to moan and groan. And this is one of the things they said. In the King James Version, it says it like this: "Would God that we had died in the land of Egypt?" In other words, they were saying, if only we had died in the land of Egypt. They were actually missing slavery. They were actually missing the beatings. They were actually missing the work that they had to do. Because sometimes when you're in pain for so long, it becomes comfortable. You actually start to be used to it. And once that pain stops, it feels weird to you. And these people were actually saying they wish they had died in the land of Egypt. After all that God had already done for them in the book of Exodus, God parted the Red Sea when Pharaoh's army was behind them and the body of water was in front of them. He parted the Red Sea, and they didn't walk on muddy land. They walked on dry land. And then not only did He allow them to walk on dry land, but He even took out Pharaoh's army by closing the road through the sea. Then what God do? He gave them manna for bread and quail for meat. He fed them while they were in the wilderness. Bitter water was made sweet enough for them to drink. But fear and depression and bitterness caused them to focus on the negative side of the events and circumstances rather than turn their hearts and minds to God, who is the source of hope and deliverance. Now in verse 3, the outcry of the children turned to the potential loss of the wives and children, meaning many of them lost their lives in the wilderness, and this heightened the drastic nature of their complaints. And then we have in verse 4 where the rebellion turned to the rejection of God's chosen and faithful leaders, who were Moses and Aaron at that time. They started choosing leaders who were not chosen by God. Don't that sound like the world today? They will find leaders to yield to their itching ears. Leaders that will sugarcoat the word. Leaders that won't tell them the truth. Leaders that won't point out the sin that can cause them to wake up in eternal hell. Leaders who preach preference and opinions versus truth. Those types of leaders will have you right back in Egypt, right back in slavery, right back in bondage, right back at the place where God already delivered you from. We're trying to move forward, not backwards. Even if we have to move forward through the wilderness. In verses 5 through 6, Moses and Aaron, they bow in submission to God. This is how great of leaders that they were. They begin to intercede for the people and propitiate God on their behalf. Now we have Joshua and Caleb, who were spies, who was going to check out the promised land, to go see like what and who they had to conquer in order to get there. And Joshua and Caleb, being faithful, they begin to mourn because of the defiance of the Israelites. They begin to rent their clothing, which was a gesture of mourning for the dead. These people were walking dead because of their defiance to God. Also, renting the clothing expresses grief or sorrow over disease or plagues, and for introducing a prophetic lament of judgment against an individual or a whole nation. But in verses 7 through 9, Joshua and Caleb took a stand even when the other men, the majority, told the Israelites that they will not be able to go against the people to possess the land. This is in chapter 13 of Numbers, verses 30 and 31. In verses 10 of the 14th chapter, the people were ready to stone Caleb and Joshua because Caleb and Joshua believed in the promised land, despite the problems in the wilderness. It reminds me of Psalms 27 and 13 when David says, "I had fainted unless I believed to see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living." We have to hold on to God's promises no matter what problems we are facing in the wilderness. And because Caleb and Joshua chose to believe despite the odds being against them, the people were ready to stone them. It reminds me of that saying, misery loves company, but God. What they did was they provoked God, meaning they rejected him in verses 11 and 12. And God's saying, after you've witnessed my power, you've witnessed my faithfulness, you've testified of my goodness, but because of this new situation, this unfamiliar territory that may not be comfortable, you seem to have forgotten my power. You seem to have forgotten that I'm a God that never changes. I'm the same today, yesterday, and forevermore. You seem to have forgotten how I parted this Red Sea for you to walk through on dry land. Your faith has simmered. Your faith has died. And what did this great leader Moses do? He intervened in verses 13 through 17 on behalf of the rebellious nation. And he did it with an appeal to God's reputation and to the power of God to fulfill his promises. So what did he tell God? God, you have to spare them because it's going to make you look bad. God's glory was at stake for this crisis. Moses like, I don't want your name to look bad because of these rebellious people. And in verses 18 through 19 of that 14th chapter of Numbers, God was slow to anger. And this describes the character of his long suffering, his patience, his kindness, and his goodness. Despite their lack of faith, despite their rebellion, despite their complaining, God spared their lives. God spared their lives, but they were punished with 40 years in the wilderness. But there was one, Caleb, who was an exception to God's judgment. The one whose message promoted faith in God when the other scouts promoted fear from the circumstances. Caleb was the one who fed the people the word and not their worries. Caleb was in the same wilderness as the rest of the Israelites, but he was built different. He followed God not a little bit, but in full capacity. Not only did his unwavering faith get him to the promised land, but even his seed possessed it. See, what Caleb was, he was a bridge for the people, not a dead end. Make sure the one you're following and the pastor that you're listening to is a bridge for you to get to your promised land and not a dead end. Caleb was the one who was built different. Are you built different? When everyone else is mumbling and complaining and moaning and groaning, are you willing to stand up and believe in the promises? When everyone else is throwing in the towel, are you still holding on to your faith? Are you still holding on to the word of God that he's going to do what he said he's going to do? God knew. He knows the plans that he has for you. He knows that he knew that you were going to have to go through the wilderness. But the same God who's the God of the mountain is the God of the valley. The same God who's the God of the promised land is the God of the wilderness. And what Caleb did, he knew that the majority was not always right. Why? Because one word of God overrules the many words of the majority. Caleb dared to be different, even when he had to stand against the majority.